Okay, we're going to start just by talking a little bit about some of the things you're going to need when you start your watercolor project, when you start these watercolor technique sheet, I guess you'd say. Of course, we're going to use our brushes from before, so these are the ones that we're going to be using. Make sure they're cleaned out well. Acrylic paint may have stuck in there. You need to make sure that's out. We're also going to be using our palette from before. This one's already got some watercolor in it. You'll need a paper towel. You also need a tissue to do one of the techniques we're going to be doing. So that's basically what you're going to need. As far as the paint goes, this is the paint, and it's in really small containers. You'll see it looks like teeny tiny, and you'll think that there won't be enough there, but you really don't need much. You can see on this palette that I'm just putting out a tiny little bit of paint there. That's all you need. Just really not much at all. It's because it's really concentrated, and we're going to add water to it, so it's going to go a long way. So we really don't need a whole lot of paint, but these are little tiny watercolor containers, and the concentration of that is going to make them pretty easily usable, and they're going to really go a long way. So of course we've got our watercolor paper, which you'll have some scraps for what we're doing, and they're about this size, so that's going to be something we're going to need. And I'm going to go ahead and show you what we're going to be shooting for here. We're going to be creating a sheet that looks like this. It's got 7 different techniques on it. Some of them have doubles. For example, this scratch in is 2. So sometimes it'll look like there's more than 7 here. Of course there is. And we'll walk through each one of these and show you how to do them. So the first thing I want to tell you about, though, is the nature of watercolor. Watercolor does not need to be cleaned out of the palette every time. This palette I used yesterday. Everything's dry on it, but all these colors will rejuvenate and come back to life. Here's a palette that I used about a year ago or so, and I want to just put a little bit of water in this and show you how this comes back to life. And it won't be gritty if you just mix it up just a little bit. All those pigment in there will just be as smooth as it can be and be very usable. And this is about the consistency that the paint will be. So you can see there's a lot of water added. It's meant to be transparent. Sometimes it's even called transparent watercolor. So that right there is actually going to be totally fine. So we can use some paint from other times and other palettes, and this will be an example of one of those. So the first thing I'm going to show you how to do is what's called a wet on dry wash. And a wet on dry wash is created by taking wet paint. So we'll come in here and rejuvenate some paint. If there's some red, we'll kind of get it going again. Rejuvenate it a bit. And then we're just going to come into the paper and just create a couple lines. This is a little dry, so we're going to make sure we have plenty of water. And again, this is plenty. Maybe even just a little bit more water. Plenty of paint to do what we got to do. So we'll come in here and do a wet on dry wash. And I'm touching very lightly. Watercolor is meant to run around. So we get an area, and it covers a large area very quickly. And you'll see when I pick this up, it'll move around, and that's what we want. We want our watercolor to be moving like that. If it doesn't move like this, then we don't have quite enough water. We want it to move all around. Now, if you get in a place where, and you can see on this one in particular, it's starting to gather at the bottom as we're moving. It's gathering, and I want to show you this real quick. A way to get rid of that is to get your brush very damp. So I'll come here, if my brush was wet, I'll take it and just kind of squeeze it out and get it damp so that it's what we sometimes call a thirsty brush. And if we just touch it along here, you'll see that that starts to disappear. And I'm going to dry it out again, get it damp, come along the bottom, and it just soaks it right up. And it makes it so that these runs won't happen on you if you would tip this a little too far, and it keeps you from having that one dark outline along the bottom of your wash. That's going to help it out a lot. So that is a wet on dry wash. Well, the next one is a wet on wet wash. Now, I could just take some blue here. I'm going to go ahead and mix some blue. I could just take my blue and put it straight into that wash, and you could see a neat effect where the blue and the red would go together and make a nice violet. And we totally could do that. I'm going to forego that right now and just show you another way. I've got this blue already mixed up, so I'm going to come in and take some pure water and lay it down so you can see what happens when we have pure water added to a wash. Or excuse me, the paint added to the pure water. So long as the water is glossy, I'll pick that up and let you see the glossiness of it. We'll come and add some blue on this side, and you'll see immediately the effect that we get with this really cool running and moving. Then if we came on the other side, go back into my red here and added some red over here, these will begin to kind of mingle together there in the middle as I pick my paper up and move it. So we'll go right into that, and that is what's wet on wet, and you can see it's really flowing and moving. And that's one of the exciting things about watercolor, and the challenging things about watercolor is that there's a lot of movement to it, and it's sometimes hard to control. Controlled chaos is a phrase that some people use to talk about watercolor. So there it is, a wet on dry wash here, a wet on wet wash here. I'm going to go right to the next technique. It's called a scratch in, and scratch in can be done with a some kind of a sharp X-Acto knife type tool. You can do it with a nail, you can do it with a paper clip that's opened up. I'm going to do it here with this, and I'm going to show you that I'm not cutting it, I'm scraping. So if I pull some lines through this wet wash here, you'll see that when it begins to dry, it's almost happening immediately here on the red side. The paint fills in that little valley that I created, and it makes a line. Now this would be good for if you're making some, if you're doing a landscape and you're doing some weeds, or if it starts to kind of look like a wood grain or something like that. And if you flick it at the top here, you'll see a pretty cool deal where you can see what would be, maybe some little roots or some little weeds that are coming up on the top. It's kind of a neat little scratch out. Now scratch in, I'm going to try on this other wet on dry wash rather, because it dried a little quicker. It's all about timing on this. You scrape a little harder, and you have to wait till it is not glossy anymore. It's got to be damp, and then when we pull through, it creates white lines. And this can be good when you're needing some contrast in those weeds, or you're needing some contrast in just need a spot where it's a little bit lighter. You can see the difference there. We have the light here, the darker there. So this is scratch in and scratch out. When you scratch out, it leaves white. When you scratch in, it leaves black. Well, the next one I'm going to do is called a lift out, and we also need a wet on dry wash to start this. So I'll go back and create a wet on dry wash with my blue. I use blue just because this gives the appearance of a sky. So that's kind of a cool deal. When we lift this out, it kind of lifts out like a cloud. It does need to be pretty dark, so you can bump your pigment up a little bit, but still, again, lots of water. We want this watercolor to run. We want it to move. We want it to do the work, not us. And part of it's just you being, as an artist, allowing yourself to let that happen. And that's hard sometimes to not control the whole situation. Okay, so, and again, I just want to tell you this. You can see the texture of the paper kind of coming out there, and that's totally okay. Texture of the paper is something that's going to come through in watercolor, and that's all right. So we have a wet on dry wash, and we're going to take now just a tissue and kind of wad it up and get it into a little ball sort of that's irregular. I'm just going to press it and hold it. The longer I hold it, the whiter it's going to be, the more paint's going to come off, and you see that's a lift out. And it has this sort of a cloud effect. Sort of just leaves it looking very wispy and cloudy there. And it's a neat effect for lots of different things. Sometimes you just need some texture on a rock, or you need a tree formation, a line of trees in the background or something like that. And this is the way you can achieve that. It's really neat, really biomorphic designs that just are hard to create unless you have some randomness. Now you can also go back and add some more paint in above. It will kind of stop where the lift out was, and then it just adds a little bit more contrast. You can also come down below that and add some color in, as needed underneath if you wanted to accentuate the bottoms of these clouds a little bit, and then come underneath like there's sky back here, and you're looking underneath. All kinds of little changes you can make to it, of course, to kind of make it your own and just make it look right. So that's a lift out. All right, the next one is dry brush, and we'll show you that. We'll show you the finished couple of those. This is an example of dry brush here. This is an example of dry brush, especially right there. You can see here I started with a wet brush and I made strokes. Right about here, the brush gets a little dry, and it starts to just sort of hit and miss. That's what we're looking for, the hit and miss of the paint. So we'll see if we can get that to work. Sometimes you're going to need to do more than one of these. You'll do 2 or 3 and pick your best. This works best if the paint is a little bit darker, so make sure I have enough pigment in there. I'm just going to start at the top with basically a wet on wet wash, wet on dry wash rather. And here in just a minute it'll start to get dry. There it goes. I'm pressing down a little harder, and down here at the bottom, those are all really nice examples of dry brush because your brush is actually drying up. Now you could also take it, as I did here, once you get it dry, and sort of separate your brush out a bit and hold it separated, and it will create some neat effects that way also. That's how you can get some wood grain effects, kind of nice. So there's the dry brush. Now, the last one I'm going to show you is glazing. Glazing is going to require you to have some dry paint already. So I'm going to take this one that I did yesterday. There's some really dry red there, and I'm going to take some of my blue. It's basically just another wet on dry wash that pulls across those really dry red areas, and it creates a darker area. You can see here it's more of a violet, and this is more just straight blue, the places that are not on the red. That's called glazing when it goes across. You can see there it is again. When it hits the red, it has a bluish tint to it, creates just a slightly violet thing. This is nice for if you have a red that's just too bright. If you felt like, well, that red is too bright, you can knock that red back just by glazing on top of it with some blue here and letting that watercolor kind of shine through, and it creates a transparency. I've got this down here, so I'll just show you this. If I took some blue and now I go and add in, if I wish that was just a little darker, I can even spread that out and just create some more contrast in here. Now you're not losing the red when you do this. It's still kind of glowing through underneath there. We're just adding the blue on top to give it just a little darker feel. Not much at all though. So that's called glazing. The last one, this is an optional one. We're going to toss this out to you. It's a neat thing you do with the toothbrush. There are lots of really cool effects that you can do with watercolor that we don't have time to cover them all, so we're just going to do some of the basics. But in this case, I'm going to take a piece of paper. This will sort of echo my watercolor paper, and then this is going to be a masking kind of piece of paper. Just imagine you had something down here like a little hill with maybe some cabins or something that you didn't want to have anything there, but you wanted a little bit of just stippling, a little bit of dots, a little something where you're kind of creating a texture of sorts. This is good to add on top of rocks. If you've got a nice gray down for your rocks, but you're also looking for a little bit of texture on top of that, well, mix up a thin wash. I'm going to get a little bit of paint on there. I'm going to grab it like this and just flick it several times. The more you flick that, of course, the more paint's going to get on there. And if you spread it out, it'll have less. And already it's a neat effect. It kind of comes off like an airbrush a little bit. And the reason I like to put this paper down is because it has a nice effect when you lift this up and you see the line that's created. So that's just some neat things that you can do. That's again an optional one. If you want to try that, you can, but you don't have to. So there's the watercolor technique concept. Here's again what we're looking for. You're going to do several different ones. I've got some others over here I'll toss on. You're just going to create each of these on a small sheet of paper like this. If this was the dry brush you liked, you just cut that out. We're going to glue it down once they're all done to a piece of cardstock, and then we're going to make sure we put a good label. This is wet on wet. That's a great example of wet on wet. A scratch in, a scratch out. There's a really good glazing. Here's a lift out. and a dry brush, and then 2 wet on dry. So you can have